Thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Steve has had a phenomenal career in the world of communications. He joined McLaren last December 2022, as Chief Communications Officer. And previous to that, he had spent a number of years at Chelsea and has also worked for a wide range of other organisations, including Deputy Press Officer for the British Embassy in Washington, DC, during quite a fascinating period in history. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure, absolutely.
First of all, I just wanted to get some background how your experiences. I've skirted over them a little bit, but maybe you could just tell us a bit more about your history and then how you ended up at McLaren.
Okay. Well, my background is about 8 or 9 months at McLaren now. Not very long, steep learning curve, and I'm still on that steep learning curve in a new industry. Before that, for 14 years, I was at Chelsea Football Club. For the latter part of that stint, I was Chief Comms Officer there. 14 years covered most of the most successful years at Chelsea under the leadership of Roman Abramovich and his board. And before that, I spent 16 years with the UK Foreign Office. Much of that time was spent at the embassy in Washington. In fact, a decade in Washington, and the last 7 years of which I was the Deputy Press Secretary. Just starting off with that journey, it's sort of my sort of journey into comms started in about 98, 99. It was very closely followed by 9/11, which then determined that America and its allies would go hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, into the war on terror, which took us into military action in Afghanistan and Iraq, and everything that was associated with that. My role at the British Embassy was obviously there to explain UK government policy. Washington being Washington, it was mostly about war and peace issues, but the embassy was 500 strong and covered every Whitehall department. So it was also education, science and technology, trade. We had to look after every visiting prime minister, every visiting secretary of state, every government minister, everybody in the shadow government, but also every member of the royal family that would pass through, including Her Majesty the Queen on her state visit, which happened in 2007, one of the final royal visits I did. But the focus was on war and peace, and because there is sort of one hyperpower in the world, which is the US, and the seat of that power is in Washington, DC, most of my role and that of my boss and other diplomats at the embassy was trying to ensure that our US cousins stayed on the same page. And certainly my role was to make sure that they try and stay on the same page in terms of communication. The US federal government communications machinery is vast, so that was quite a challenge. But we had the benefit of a huge UK government machinery behind us that were awake 5 hours ahead. So we were tasked each morning with lines to take, with the messages that we needed to deliver to our US interlocutors and opposite numbers, but also the message that we should be giving to the UK media. So huge support system, and we would wake up to that. I wouldn't say script. Script is too pejorative, but certainly with that guidance. I moved on from Washington to Chelsea Football Club. They headhunted me from Washington. I'd helped them out on a couple of pre-season tours. They'd been over to the States. And so went into there as their sort of head of media relations. And very quickly found that I didn't have that massive load of machinery and structure and support behind me. Anything that was decided at Chelsea Football Club in terms of strategy and in terms of messaging really fell down to the press department and myself or one or two others. My journey in Chelsea Football Club took me to become the Chief Comms Director. And I probably sat next to, was a shadow next to 14 different head coaches over my time there, before I took the elevated role, the more strategic role of Chief Comms. And I probably had to deal with everything that football could throw at a football club, at a fan base, at a Chief Comms Officer. And so when Chelsea won the Club World Cup back in February in Abu Dhabi last year. That completed the trophy set for Chelsea. There was no other trophy that they hadn't won. It completed the set. And what does a fan base and a football club do when that happens is that they will, for a short time, rub all those trophies in everybody's faces and then say, right, what do we do now? Well, we go again. After 14 years in that role, which 14 years anywhere is a long time, but 14 years at a Premier League club can be a lifetime, and at Chelsea Football Club, where the media scrutiny is unlike many other clubs, I really didn't feel I had, not necessarily the energy, but it felt like it would be rinse and repeat if I stayed. So I decided back in February I'd start looking at something else. Didn't know what I was going to do. Never really had a firm career plan. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. Chelsea's owner came under UK sanctions and sanctions from other people. He decided to sell the club to save the club because the club became a sanctioned entity. And so he sold the club, and new American owners bought the club in May. I helped bed them in. And in July, McLaren Racing came calling. And I started talking to McLaren in July and made a decision to jump ship from Chelsea after those 14 years. And I joined McLaren in December. So now been in post as Chief Comms Officer McLaren since then. And we can get into how different motor racing is to football, how different football is to government, but we can also get into how similar communications is across all three of those.
Yes. I was going to ask, moving from such a sort of a powerful, influential role in government and communication at such a critical time with 9/11 having happened, and then going into football, what did you see were apart from the lack of the support network that you mentioned earlier, what were the main differences that you felt, and that you had different skills that you had to bring to football that you perhaps hadn't utilized or knew you needed when you were in government communications?
Well, I think, as I said, in government communications, there is quite a big support network that you have at your disposal. And while you are given the authority and the space to make decisions within that guidance, there's very much a safety net, but there's also very strict guidance as to what you can and can't say. I think the scope with which I had to work with at Chelsea at first was quite unnerving, because there wasn't that safety net, and you knew that anything that went out from the club was going out not under your name, because you're still just an unnamed spokesman or spokesperson, but you were really driving those comms and driving that messaging. I really found that quite pleasing, because I've always felt that if you're going to be an effective comms director, or in fact an effective communications person at whatever level, you really need line of sight of decision making, or your department head needs line of sight of decision making, and that's certainly something that I got at Chelsea. I think from time to time, I would be presented with a scenario that the club would say, well, how would it look if we did this? I may react and say, well, that wouldn't look very good. And they might say, well, we did it yesterday, so make it look good. But by and large, I argued for, from the very beginning, line of sight of decision making, being in those rooms so I could raise the red flag or the orange flag, and generally I got that. That gave me a degree of.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's very interesting, because there's a very strong train of thought within communications that communications should be part of the C-suite, have access to as a management function, and it doesn't always happen. So that must have been very reassuring for you that you did have that input most of the time.
It was, and I think that gave me the degree of comfort going into the club that I was going to get that, because football is a very febrile communications atmosphere. Football itself is inherently tribal. You play your matches in your stadiums in the community in which the football club was born. The fans of football clubs really believe that those football clubs are theirs. They have such a huge vested interest in everything that goes on at the club. whether it be ticket prices, whether it be the cost of subsidised travel, whether it is the standard of bread rolls that are being served in Concourse C. They really have a huge interest in everything that goes on at the club. And so therefore, everything that the club does is of huge interest to that fan community. And so therefore, if you're making decisions, you are almost making decisions, not just on behalf of the club, but you're making them on behalf of the fan. So to have that line of sight of decision-making, you really have to know what the fan base looks like, what the fan base feels like, and you have to get to know the culture of the club you're in to be able to guide the board, guide their strategic decisions, so that they are not making decisions that will immediately alienate them from the fan base, because that can very quickly go pear-shaped, can very quickly go wrong. There were decisions made, obviously, by Premier League clubs and by Chelsea and by Liverpool and Man City and other clubs, obviously, where they got it wrong. One of those was the European Super League, where about 6 clubs got it absolutely wrong. But those things will happen from time to time. And when there are huge financial opportunities, as the European Super League seemed to offer, I think a number of clubs jumped to try and get on that train as it was leaving the station, under a lot of pressure to do so in a very short time frame. I think had they had longer to consider it, and had comms directors been in the room when they had said yes to doing it, I think the decision might have been slightly different. But by and large, I got the line of sight of decision making at Chelsea that I needed, and that's certainly the case here at McLaren, because I don't think I could take a position that didn't give me that line of sight.
Given just finally on Chelsea, given the sort of Goldfish Bowl scenario that you're in, you talk about the fans, but obviously the newspapers and the journalists as well are looking for every little story to write about and trying to find controversy in anything and everything that they possibly can. How did you manage which stories or which criticisms you would react to and which you would just ignore, based on the fact that you could potentially be putting out little fires thrown by fan groups or journalists on a daily basis, if you so wished?
Well, when I first joined Chelsea back in 2008, it was a club that wasn't particularly open in terms of access. It entered into a lot of litigation with newspapers and threatened litigation with newspapers. It was a club that said no a lot. It had a reputation, I think unfairly, with the media at that time for being economical with the truth. And so walking into that environment, it was something that I wanted to change. Simon Greenberg, the great director of comms that hired me and was my boss for a couple of years there, when I told him that we needed to change the landscape and that we needed to improve the relationship with the media, and actually we needed to hug our enemies a little tighter, which you need to do from time to time, he called it the Brave New Era.
He was a journalist himself, wasn't he? So
he was. He came from the Evening Standard when Peter Kenyon came in, and when they hired Jose Mourinho first time round. Simon Greenberg was phenomenal, a real phenomenal individual, great operator, real fantastic networker, but a seriously good communicator. That being said, there was quite a combative relationship between Chelsea and the media when I joined. I saw it as my challenge to try and put that back on an even keel. It's a long old road we're on with journalists and with media organizations. There's a saying that don't pick a fight with people who buy ink by the barrel load, because they're always going to have the final say. They're always going to have the last laugh. So it is about picking your fights carefully. And I sort of went on an education program with the board, but also with a few of the key journalists that causes trouble, which about the fact that it was a two-way street, that we would open up access, but we would do so because we were looking for fair and balanced reporting. That's all we can ever ask of anybody, fair and balanced reporting. It was an education process with the board to say, look, don't remonstrate with journalists just because you don't like the way they've written something. If it's inaccurate, we'll get it corrected. If it's defamatory, then we'll get it taken down. If they refuse to, then we can start thinking about legal letters. But don't complain because you just don't like the way somebody's written something. Opinion is fine. If we're criticized for something we've done wrong and the criticism is fair, let it go. That took about 2 years, I think, before I really started seeing consistent progress in that field, and that the board were less prickly about some of the coverage we were getting. And probably took another year longer still before I really felt like the media believed what they were getting from Chelsea Football Club was the truth. Don't forget, in football, you're working in a very competitive briefing market. It's not just players, not just agents, it's friends, it's girlfriends, it's friends of friends, it's other clubs. And so it's very important in football as a communicator that you are credible, that you are the one authoritative voice, or the club is, whoever's speaking. And for that, we needed to increase the access. We needed to be more open, be more honest, give them more information, and not be so combative. And I think, well, I know we got into a good place with that within about 2 or 3 years. It took longer than I thought it would, but that was a huge learning process for me in terms of trying to turn relationships around. I'm very pleased to say that having come to McLaren, every one of our communications team on our different race series are very, very highly regarded. So I haven't had the same issues with McLaren that I did with Chelsea. But I think it's fair to say, and I think if you talk to most journalists in football, that the Chelsea Football Club media operation over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, if not longer, was certainly considered one of the best and one of the easiest to work with, and one of the most credible. I think just on that, I would say that with working in government to working in football and now working in motor racing, I think it's very important that you carry the same principles with you. You'd be surprised to see how many communicators don't have a set of principles they work to. And I was very fortunate to work for Sir Christopher Mayer, former British ambassador to the US, who sadly passed away last year. But he and I, when I was a junior press officer, he and I had some very crunchy work to do in connection with Afghanistan and UK military action with the US. And as a junior press officer, he asked me one day before going down to see Wolf Blitzer and do a live interview on CNN what my media philosophy was. And he could see I was a bit of a deer in the headlights with that question. So we grabbed a pen, he grabbed a piece of paper, and we wrote out the 10 commandments that we would aspire to keep to when we work together, so that I could trust him, he could trust me. And that's still 10 commandments that I work to today. They are all statements of the bleeding obvious. So it is never lie. Your credibility will be destroyed immediately. Don't waffle. If you don't know the answer, don't lead them up a garden path. You'll embarrass yourself. You'll say something you shouldn't. And always respect the tyranny of the deadline and the insatiable appetite for editors, of editors for fresh copy. Those are just 3. There are 7 others that I have given to each one of my teams, because it's very important that while the media audiences are quite different, the mechanics of communications actually stays the same. And if you stick to some principles, it stops you getting in trouble that some others might do.
It's fascinating. I'd love to hear the rest of the commandments at some point, certainly. Just finally on Chelsea, we're not obviously touching too much on what happened last year, but in terms of biggest challenges once you'd established that understanding and engagement with the media and that internal culture, see you're dealing with a large number of highly paid, highly successful, attention attracting young men as well. What were the biggest challenges that you found in that role? Because obviously that's very different from government.
Well, I think, I mean, if you looked at, you'd have 20, 24 players in a squad. Most teams now have a women's team too. You've also got academies that may be 100, 200, 300 strong. With all of those players, there are various agents and other entities and satellites that whirl around them. So it's never just the player that you're dealing with. I'd have to say, in all my time and the hundreds of players that I dealt with from a sort of first team perspective, I think 99% of the time they were all fantastic to deal with in terms of the media. They all understood the importance of it. They all understood the importance of the club and its reputation. Football clubs and football fans don't like talking about brands, but they understood the importance of the brand and their part in it, and also their part to play where sponsors might be concerned. But they also understood, most of them, the importance of their individual brand. Now, the players that didn't understand the importance of their individual brand and how that would play into that career often hid behind other players and tried to avoid doing media. In football teams, you always try and spread the responsibility, but also spread the love and spread the exposure. And sometimes getting some players to do media was more difficult than others. I think the big difficulties we would have had at a football club would have been when players got into trouble in their private lives. But we always made a point of drawing a line between football and private life. Private life had to be looked after by their agents. Football clubs are not, they don't police their players outside of the normal working hours. We're not with them 24 hours a day. And it's just not possible to do. And I think in order for you to be able to answer media inquiries credibly, you've got to see the whites of the eyes of the players. You've got to be able to triangulate some of the information that you're getting. You've got to make sure that you know what you're saying is absolutely true. And when things go on in players' private lives, it's quite difficult to sort of pin that down. And also, I think the players also don't want the clubs having that much control over them too. So there was quite a line drawn in the sand in terms of what happened at the club and what happened in their private lives. Some of the bigger challenges in football would have been fan behaviour, whether it was fan violence, whether it was racism, whether it was anti-Semitism. One of the issues that football has always had is that some of society's ills come and land on football clubs' doorsteps, and there's bravery in numbers. And there's bravery in football stands where you can't necessarily single out individuals. And so it was not a problem that was unique to Chelsea. Absolutely not. These issues go up and happen up and down the country, indeed on the continent and elsewhere in the world in football. But issues of racism, anti-Semitism, fan violence in and outside the stadium, much less so these days on the third count. But those were often some of the more difficult things that we had to deal with, because they were seen as something that was culturally wrong with that club. And so trying to educate supporters and supporter groups and sort of bring them on the journey with a modern day club in terms of what is acceptable in a football stadium, that's the long-term challenge, and was the long-term challenge.
Did that prompt you to advise the board to undertake more sort of community or CSR initiatives in order to help redress and rebalance the narrative?
I think that's something that clubs will always want to try and do, and they always want to be a force for good in their community, because don't forget, these are the communities in which the clubs were born back in the late 1890s, early 1910, 1920, etc. I mean, Chelsea's been there since 1906. Those have always been there. In terms of dialing them up, you would dial them up to deal with a situation rather than try and mitigate, if you know what I mean. The force for good work that was done off the pitch, they were never done as a PR exercise. They were always done to try and positively affect a situation. So remember Roman Abramovich, he could see that anti-Semitism was growing in Europe. He knew that there were instances of anti-Semitism at the club. So we put a real focus on that. That wasn't driven by the PR department. That was driven by him, by Mr. Abramovich himself. And so we put a lot of effort into that. We took supporter groups to Auschwitz on tour. Now, these weren't supporters that had been found guilty of anti-Semitism. This was an offer out to supporters. We are going on a fact-finding, we're going on an educational trip as a club to Auschwitz, and we would like to take you with us. Who would like to come? So we had a lot of right-minded supporters that come, and supporter groups and official supporter groups. So what they were able to do was they were able to spread the word about their experiences of Auschwitz and how they understood how wrong anti-Semitism was. And they did a good job of helping us educate the fan base. But yeah, not done as a PR exercise. not done to sort of deflect media attention away from what was going on. Rather, what we were doing was pointing more acutely at it and saying, we're doing this because there is an issue here.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Obviously, the nature of fandom is very different in motorsport to football. It comes in a very different shape and form, and the schedule of the competitions are different as well. Can you just talk us through how your role is different at McLaren, and also what surprised you in terms of the differences that perhaps you weren't expecting?
Sure. So I've come in as Chief Communications Officer. We have 5 different race series here at McLaren. We've got Formula One, IndyCar, we've got 2 electric series, which is Formula E and Extreme E. And then we also have esports with our Shadow McLaren team. Surprising things about McLaren, let's say the size of the organization surprised me. We're 1,000 strong in McLaren Racing. My rather amateur knowledge of motor racing, I thought that it was very much a traveling circus, supported by a few people back at base, perhaps. But McLaren Racing is 1,000 strong. Our factory here that works on the Formula One cars is 24 hours, 2 shifts. Formula One cars are updated every 17 minutes. There's an upgrade on that car, whether it be software, whether it be hardware, whether it be bits of aero, bodywork. Every 17 minutes, the cars are upgraded, which just tells you the pace at which they are developing off the track. Motor racing is much more commercial than football. Football obviously has their sponsors, and they need that additional sponsorship money in which to operate and pay the very high salaries they do. But football also plays football in its own stadiums. It has its own revenue, food and beverage, ticket prices, merchandise. Merchandise being a very small part of it, really. But football clubs have revenue streams at their disposal. Motor racing really generally doesn't. Somebody once said, you can make a small fortune in motor racing if you start with a very large one. There isn't a lot of money to be made in motor racing, and certainly most people in motor racing don't make money. Sponsorship allows you to race. So without partners, we don't race. Their sponsorship provides the funds which we plow back into the performance of the cars. And so one of the surprising things for me at McLaren Racing is just how commercial it is. Everything we do, pretty much everything we do, is with a focus on partners, very partner facing. And it's making sure that they are getting the value for money, they're getting the access that we can provide as a race team, because they are paying for us to go racing.
Sorry, carry on.
And I was just going to say, obviously, because it's a very different type of sport, and because motor racing isn't born out of the communities in which it races, we don't race in our own race circuits. We travel around the world racing at race circuits that belong to third parties. We don't have a control over ticket prices. We don't have we don't necessarily own the behavior of fans that go to those circuits. The relationship with motor racing fans is therefore very different than it is with football fans, where 2 or 3 times a week you are performing in front of them. You can touch them, you can hear them. In motor racing, it's quite different. It's no less passionate, I don't think, but it's certainly different, and it's a different kind of relationship where most of our contact with them will be through our digital offerings, and but rather than actually seeing them face to face and having them walking around our concourses and sitting in the seats of the stadium, it's a slightly more distant, but no less passionate.
I guess the misconception of the lay fan may be that the main focus is on Formula One, but you just alluded to the fact you've got to juggle 5 different teams that have different schedules and different priorities. How do you manage that?
Well, I'm very lucky that I've got a communications team in each series, and at any one time, those communications teams are in the four corners of the world. Obviously, with IndyCar, they're focused on North America, and could be any given weekend we'll be racing somewhere in the US. But obviously, with Formula One, we're in the four corners of the world, and certainly also with Formula E. But we have communications directors in each team with a number of staff, which are also connected to the social and digital for those teams also. So I am very lucky in that I sit across those 3 or 4 communications teams who are absolutely excellent at the top of their game. They know their race series, they know their teams, they know their team principals, they know their drivers, and the social and digital teams know what their fan bases need. So I'm really here for strategic guidance to make sure that they've got some sort of oversight and control from centre, but also advice, guidance, and steering from centre here at McLaren headquarters. I go to about between 12 and 14 Formula One races a year, which is a significant number, and 2 or 3 IndyCar races, 2 or 3 electric races a year. McLaren doesn't need a communications director that is at every race. We've set it up that we've got really good, strong communications teams that are very well plugged in to the team principal, to the race engineers, to the key principal people in the race teams. Again, goes back to that line of sight decision making, being there to offer counsel, offer advice on presentation, but also on any policies and strategic moves that they want to make. So whereas Chelsea, I was very much hands-on, very much at the coalface most of the time. Here I can take a more elevated, more strategic view, which I think benefits all 5 race series. My day-to-day contact with the journalists is now their day-to-day contact with the journalists. I will spend as much time as I can with the media and journalists when I go to races, and I'm always open to contact with them and socializing with them when I'm not at races. But I need to allow my comms directors and my comms teams to have those day-to-day too. That's not my role. So it's more of a strategic role, guiding those teams and making sure they've got the resources they need, making sure they've got the information they need, and any guidance or advice they need also.
The world of Formula One has changed significantly in the last few years since Liberty Media got involved and Bernie Ecclestone to have dropped out of his role of control of the sport. How much have you been surprised about how beyond the sponsors and partners? I'm sure a part of your role has to be liaising with the governance and the ownership of the sport as it's going through this evolution, which has been quite dramatic at times, in order to increase the appeal of F1, which has become even more global and more popular than it was when it was already a high bar to start with.
Yeah, I think, well, having only been here for 9 months, I don't really know what the old the look and feel inside the Formula One paddock was like, although I hear about it quite a lot, but these are only anecdotal memories that I get. But I think certainly from my point of view and that of others is that Liberty Media are doing a fantastic job. I came into the sport thinking there would probably be a bit more sort of political infighting, a bit more skullduggery behind the scenes. Certainly the Formula One of old seemed to be, a lot of the media coverage seemed to be determined by personalities more than performance. I think Liberty Media have brought more of and this is not a criticism against the previous ownership, I don't know them and I don't know how they ran, but my sense and what I'm being told by others is that Liberty Media have brought a maturity to Formula One, with much more of a focus on delivering the product and delivering entertainment, and trying to bring the sport forward and up into one of the elite sports, and certainly trying to increase the fan base and following. I think one of the most astute things they did was obviously to bring Netflix in, which landed just at the right time during lockdown, pandemic, binge watching. But nobody should underestimate the effect that Netflix has had on the sport and continues to have on the sport. And I think as such, whereas the first 2 seasons of Netflix, you didn't really see the big teams getting involved. I think, while there might be 1 or 2 characters in the sport that still question whether Netflix is the right thing, I think the vast majority of people in Formula One really appreciate what Netflix has done for the sport. And certainly we as a team do everything we can to make sure they've got the access they need, because they are vital in us telling our story. We cannot just rely on the traditional media to do that for us, and I think Netflix does a fantastic job. And I think that's where Liberty have come in and really open-minded and really quite progressive in the way that they see in terms of promoting the sport. And you've only got to look at how adaptable this sport is in terms of, in part as a result of Netflix effect and the viewership and eyeballs and fan base that is now in the US, they added Miami as a race. They added Vegas as a race this year, which is going to be off the charts in terms of entertainment. If you try and add a 39th game to football, playing a ball, we've all seen what happened there and how everybody riles up against that idea. But there's an adaptability factor to Formula One, which is really quite impressive. They can move so quickly in terms of moving into different markets. And also, if a market drops off, such as China because of the pandemic, they can point somewhere else. It's really impressive.
You spoke earlier about your role being very much the sort of the overseer, guiding the day-to-day teams who are in place. From a strategic perspective, can you talk a little bit about what whether or not you came in with an intention, or whether you've discovered things that you want to bring to Formula One through your role with McLaren?
I don't think it's necessarily to Formula One. I think my primary aim is making sure that McLaren's story gets told. I think particularly in this first year I'm here, it's our 60th anniversary year. So a lot of what we've done as a team, and this isn't just a comms thing, this comes down to partnerships, our relationships with partners who also want to tell our great story. It also comes down to the brand and creativity departments and the marketing department, which are behind some of the great campaigns we've run this year. This year, the focus has been about telling our story. Now, there are 2 types of fans in motor racing. Generally, the avid fans who are long-term Formula One fans, but are really interested in the minutiae of Formula One. And then there are trend fans who have come to the sport more lately, whether through Netflix or by other means. And the trend fans I suppose, would think of as being slightly younger demographic. But what's interesting about the trend fans is that we found out is that they are as interested in the status of a team, with their fandom as they are about the sport just being a modern sport being turned onto it lately. So we benefit greatly from our history, our 60 years of history, being the second most successful team in Formula One over their 60 years. And so we've got to, in terms of audience, we've got to think about what we're doing for the avid fan, but also what we're doing for the trend fan. And that certainly comes into play in terms of our social and digital team, which reports into marketing. They've got to make sure that they're servicing both and connecting with both, and making sure they're connecting back into the team. In terms of what I saw my role coming in, I think in talking to Zach Brown, the CEO, I think he was very keen. We were both very keen in trying to get McLaren into places where you might not necessarily expect to see them. So, of course, we're all over motorsport, we're all over at key races, traditional sports media, sometimes back page, normally inside of the book, but lifestyle media, tech media, that's somewhere where we felt we could really make a difference. And starting placing Zach and McLaren as a brand in places you wouldn't expect to see them. And that includes places, like the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and working more closely with titles like New York Times and Washington Post, just getting into places where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see us. That's one of the sort of the main initial sort of pieces of work that we're trying to do in my first few months and first year here.
Yes, you've talked about the global geography of the race series. You mentioned Las Vegas, managing the team's communications in Las Vegas with all the razzmatazz that goes on there is going to be very different to potentially doing it in South America, or with the challenges that come from somewhere like Saudi Arabia, for instance. How do you address those? What's your approach to addressing those different geographical in levels of enthusiasm and controversy?
Well, I think on the one hand, in terms of media operations in Formula One are very similar wherever you go. It's not the traveling circus that everybody thinks it is. I think that's too it's not sophisticated enough description of Formula One, but certainly it is a sport that picks up and goes to the next place and puts itself down. But it doesn't want to be isolated from the local community. It also doesn't want to be isolated from local media. So the media environment is pretty similar each place you go, but what we try and do is we will try and land media pieces in that market that we're going racing ahead of time. If we're not able to do that, we'll certainly engage with local journalists and local media when we're there. Our partners also have an expectation that we will help them, or they would want us to be visible in their markets in which they're trading, where we go racing. And so there are particular partnership campaigns that we may enter into in going to different regions and different countries, and different partner activations also that will mean more for them in certain countries. So it's not just about the media track, it's about how we can help elevate our partners' brands and how we can help them activate in that market too. So those are all slightly different, but when it comes to actual communications and managing races, they tend to be fairly similar. The media pack remains fairly similar. And also, don't forget, there are broadcast rights holders. There are rights holders for Formula One that you need to make sure that you are servicing while at track and managing those obligations. Those are fairly formulaic in terms of press conferences, media pen appearances, drivers talking to Sky F1, talking to Service TV, talking to other rights holders. So it can be quite formulaic, and there's a degree of comfort in that. But I think we're always looking to do something different, always looking to differentiate ourselves from the other race teams. Because if you're not careful, you do end up doing the same thing at each racetrack, and that's not what McLaren's about. McLaren's an awesome place to work. It's also a fun team, and I think our partners get more from us, or get different things from us and more from us than they would from other teams. And we need to make sure that we're activating for them in each market we go into that makes sense for them.
Fantastic. You mentioned the esports team. I wondered if you could give us a little bit more background into that and how that works, because that's obviously a very, very different beast, but I suspect maybe in some ways very similar, but it obviously a very new concept for the traditional sports fan.
Well, it is, and I think this comes out of the fact that you recognise that people consume their media in different ways. Gaming has grown exponentially over the last few years, and the gaming community also too. And I think it's another way that we can reach McLaren fans and motor racing fans through esports. And so we've got our shadow McLaren team, which is shadow to the Formula One team. Hugely successful, world champions last year, and with the world championship driver. And this is something that's really only going to grow. Over the last 2 years, certainly since pandemic, we've been doing our racing here on site in our shadow McLaren studio with our 3 or 4 sims lined up, and we'll race live from here. But this next season upcoming, we will be going back to live events in cities in and around the race series. And that is a great opportunity for esports and race fans to attend, to watch, and get back to seeing these things live, which is really quite exciting. As I say, it's growth. It's fairly new in terms of our racing history. It's certainly very new for us, but it's again another way of connecting with our fan base and providing another offering, not just to our fan base, but also to sponsors.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, does that attract different sponsors, or is it just using the same portfolio of sponsors that you've got across the board?
I think we're very fortunate across our 5 race series that we can offer our sponsors a portfolio. So if what you want is the heat and light that Formula One brings,
mm-hmm.
obviously you've got the Formula One team. If sustainability or D&I is a particular angle that you want to get, then we've got Formula E for sustainability. In XE, which is also electric racing, we have our first female driver for McLaren ever, in Emma Gilmore. IndyCar offers you a different marketplace in which to activate. So across the different 5 race series, we can say to our sponsors, you can sort of pick and choose, as to what you want to get involved in, what's important to you, and we can help you sort of activate in those markets by being on our cars in our different series.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. We've had a few questions. I'm going to try and pare them down very briefly, if that's okay.
Sure.
One of our viewers has asked about strength test, how often you strength test crisis communications. I was going to build out from that and say, obviously, unlike football, there's greater elements of risk and safety that need to be taken on board, and you're not using, as you mentioned, you're not using your own venue, you're using other venues. So in terms of, and there are other issues that come up regularly over the last few years. We've had you mentioned the great news that you've got a female driver, but diversity and gender equality and opportunities like that. There are probably a multitude of issues that you can have to prepare for and have to sort of address over the course of time. So could you just talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of some of the let's say benign inquiries, and I don't mean this to belittle the issues, but in terms of gender pay, gender equality, diversity, what I found in motor racing is that those are not necessarily big ticket items for media. Mm-hmm. We obviously have our policies on those, and therefore we have our lines to take on those and a strategy around that, which we will keep a continual eye on and keep refreshing as we feel necessary. In terms of crisis communications, certainly, I mean, we can keep going back to football because that's where I spent so long. Mm-hmm. In football crisis communications, you are tested on a crisis almost every week at a certain level. So those are kept very fresh, very front of mind, and actually you're dealing with them almost on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. Mostly because each football team is only 3 losses away from a crisis. Mm-hmm. If you are at the top of the league and 5 points clear, 10 points clear, the media is not interested in telling negative stories about you because somebody else is in crisis and it's their time. So, but you're only 3 losses away. If that top team loses 3 games, all of a sudden, people start shining lights in dark places and they start telling negative stories about you because there's an appetite for it. There isn't an appetite for it when you're flying high. In terms of crisis communications in motor racing, and again, my limited experience so far after 9 months in the job is that for each race series, we will have a crisis communications plan for each race. And the main philosophy behind that won't change for each race, but the contact details do. The exit routes do, the pathways to drivers if they go into a wall and if we need to get to them quickly, the medical unit, those things change. So those are refreshed for each race. Most of those are practicalities. Most of those are about mechanics, about how to get things done, who to inform, when to inform them. A lot of those don't change. They change per track just because the geography changes. But yes, I think race teams would be foolish if they didn't have a crisis communications plan in place for crashes, for serious incidents. In terms of, I think in part, my experience of motor racing so far, and certainly Formula One, is that it is not as personality driven as I thought it might be. It is certainly very technical, and the interest from the media is much more intent on cars, performance, upgrades, and results. Much less so on personality than might have done in the past.
So that means where Jose Mourinho or one of the other Chelsea managers was the focal point, Zach Brown perhaps doesn't have the same level of interest.
No, I don't think it's the same level of interest, because I think what football, and this goes back to crisis communications and goes back to the question, is that you face so many more crises in football because it's personality driven. The media, the football media, bless them, love them, but they did seem merely to exist sometimes to drive a wedge between a player and his coach, the coach and the board and the fans, the coach and the fans. There was always something in their personality driven, and therefore you always face with some level of crisis. The motor racing media, certainly the media around Formula One, of which I'm most familiar with now out of the race series, are not interested in causing those kinds of cracks and schisms. They are more interested in performance and why you're not performing. Why haven't the upgrades worked? It's more about performance, it's more about engineering. I wouldn't describe it as more cerebral. I would not perhaps even describe it as more benign, because I don't want to do either a disservice. But it's a very different media pack here, which lends itself to less crises of a personnel nature and a personal nature, whereas in football, those certainly drove most of the crisis we had to deal with. So, which goes back to the point in that our crisis planning is around events and what could happen at an event, more than it is some of the other issues that other organizations deal with, because it's personality driven.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Just to wrap up, I'm personally fascinated by your comms principles that you alluded to earlier, but just for our audience, that it's all of them are communications professionals who are passionate about sport. Could you give some advice based on your incredible career, how to get into the sports industry, and what advice you would give to them if they're not in it, or what would be the key learnings and summaries that you would say to those who are already in the sports industry in communications that have served you well over your incredible career?
Well, I can't go from my own experience of getting into sports, because I sort of fell into it quite luckily. But that's because I did a bit of work with Chelsea over 2 pre-season tours, as I mentioned. I think I've hired some really good people at Chelsea Football Club who either came up on our radar because of work we'd done with partners or with sponsors or with other organizations, or who were recommended to us. But quite a few people we hired because they wrote into the club and didn't express a desire to work for that club because they supported that club. That can actually sometimes be detrimental, because in comms you've got to have a bit of a cold, hard stare at an issue, a non-compassionate look at an issue in order to steer your way clearly through it. And sometimes, as evidenced by staff who did support Chelsea, there were sometimes they had blue blinkers on sometimes when they were making decisions. Now, we hired some really good, very good young people who just expressed their desire to work in a comms environment that matched ours. They didn't know what my 10 commandments were, but they expressed some of the same principles about honesty, integrity, being able to tell the story, forming, productive relationships with media that were based on respect. Now, not everybody espoused those ideas, but they came through in some of the correspondence we had, and we would sometimes give those people a chance. Now, Chelsea is not a place that you really want to come in and cut your teeth. Chelsea, clubs like Chelsea, and certainly the top 6, are more likely to hire people already that have expertise or some experience. but youth and ability will always win over age and treachery. So I think to get people in young and experienced, I think there's so much that can be done, so much molding and so much sort of teaching and sort of guidance you can give them. You can very quickly mold them into very good comms professionals. So I wouldn't see youth and inexperience as a barrier to getting into a Premier League club. I think writing in and expressing your passion for communications and how you think you can both learn from the expertise of the club, but also build on that. I think is certainly a good way in, and it worked for a few people that came into football that I know of.
Brilliant. Steve, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure. Provided some fascinating insights and anecdotes. I'm sure the audience and those who watch it in due course will take a lot from it. It's been a fascinating experience. Really like to thank you on behalf of everyone for taking the time today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for asking me to come on with you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheers. Take care.
Bye.